Alright, at last I get to make a video where I don't talk for 40 minutes. This ought to be a slightly shorter one because I have just a few directions for people who are debating the Stoa team policy topic for some broad spectrum negative arguments that I think you'll get a lot of mileage out of. Now, your topic does not have a center to it. It has a subject matter, but the topic is worded so loosely that there are all sorts of affirmative approaches that are perfectly topical, but have very little in common, and the strategies that you have at the beginning of the year before you really know the lay of the land just aren't going to stretch very far. So what I think you do in a situation like that is you try to clump together large clusters of affirmatives and then think of a direction to go that will cover a lot of them. And so where I would begin is I think you're going to have the place that a lot of people are going to begin thinking about this topic is that there are certain kinds of pollution, kinds of runoff, kinds of products that if you can rein them in, then that's how you reform marine natural resource policy. So that's the shark finning, and that's the flame retardant runoff affirmatives, things like that. And one of the things that a lot of affirmatives are going to do, or at least they may be tempted to do when they first see the advocacy and the solvency evidence, is to just pass regulations that restrict companies' ability to put products like that into the market. And one of the things you can do is you can go do a little bit of research, do some searches with the terms voluntary approach or voluntary environmental. Now, when you do voluntary approach, you should have environment or pollution somewhere in there, and you'll have articles come up that talk about the wave of regulatory approaches pretty much that started around the time of the Bush administration, maybe a little bit before, that you go to the industry and you tell them this is what we're probably going to be able to pass as far as command and control regulation. If you can reach an agreement that somehow is a win-win for you, that helps you actually be more profitable or to outcompete your competitors, and you voluntarily enter into that, then we'll just monitor compliance and we'll hold the regulation over you as the enforcement if you fall short on your promises. And there's a fairly good bit of literature saying that this is a much more business-friendly way to accomplish the same outcome. Now, there's also a lot of evidence that answers that. So what I would do if I were you is I would go out and I would cut it both ways and say voluntary agreements and voluntary approaches to regulation are good, but then also cut evidence that says that incentives and voluntary agreements fail and that actually command and control is the only thing that works when you're dealing with substances that are really dangerous but also really profitable. Because what you can do, you can't do it in necessarily every debate, but you can do it when you have an alum judge, or I think you could probably do it when you had most open-minded parent-coach judges, is you can counterplan. Because this is a very straightforward counterplan, and the competition is very clear, and you can be very rhetorically appealing and say, we are making this debate about should it be regulation or should it be business friendly. That's all it is. This is not playing fast and loose with theory. This is not running something esoteric. They're saying that this ought to be a government solution. We're saying that this ought to be negotiated with business so that they can hold up their responsibilities and at the same time maximize their profitability. So that's something you can go out and you can prepare yourself with. You want to have it both ways because you may find that there are smart affirmatives who find the evidence for their own particular harm area and their plan is a voluntary agreement. Their plan consists of negotiation with business or providing incentives or providing some sort of cap and trade system to where they can compete with one another and see who can become the most efficient. And if they do that, you want to be able to indict that approach and say that really the efforts to monitor those, the monitoring goes by the wayside, and the history for really damaging substances and pollution cases has been that command and control is necessary, and then you can counterplan with that. And you can say, once again, we're making this debate about, is it that you let the businesses regulate themselves, or that certain products are so unsafe, the government has to step in and say, this is not allowed. You can't earn your profit at the expense of public safety. So that, I don't think it'll work in 100% of cases, but I think it'll come in handy a lot of the time. I think that a lot of the affirmatives people think of at the very beginning of the year, what is it that's getting into the marine environment and how do we ban it? You can have a pretty broad spectrum approach to how to debate those cases, even if someone finds a pollutant that you didn't think of. A second argument that I think you want to go after, I believe I talked about this in the previous video that I made about the Stoa TP topic, and that is to be ready to debate energy prices. And there are a couple of updates on that front. There was a very good article in the New York Times on April 27, 2013. It was an op-ed by Benjamin Alter and Edward Fishman, and the title of the article was The Dark Side of Energy Independence. And it laid out in kind of vague terms that as the United States proceeds with innovations that change its energy dependence, that has kind of dire consequences for a lot of the shaky regimes that are coming out of the Arab Spring. And really the way they run their economies is by having a lot of revenue coming in from their oil production. So the United States development in fracking, the United States strides forward in moving toward nuclear power. All of those have kind of dire consequences for the Middle East and for stability in the Middle East. I would start with that article and be looking for key terms. One of the ones I found intriguing, the first couple of searches didn't turn up very many other people using this term, but Petrol States. Petrol States. Alter and Fishman talk a lot about Petrol States. They mention it a few times, and that, I think, can get you some pretty recent evidence, internal link evidence for this argument. Now, what I think is probably the path of least resistance for putting the argument together at the beginning of the season is just to make it an Iraq argument, because the evidence that says that Iraq is really trying to get a lot of profit out of its oil production and use it to rebuild its society is quite good, which means if you can do the work to demonstrate that any affirmative plan that has to do with resources, with offshore drilling, with shipping oil, anything that has a contact point with the petroleum industry, if you can do the work to show that there would be a change in energy prices, then if it made energy prices go down, you could say that the Iraqi government would be strapped, which means that there would be a lot of austerity, there would be a lot of misery and desperation, and it once again becomes a seedbed for Al-Qaeda. There's Middle East instability, and you can win some big impacts off that. Or if they manage to try to turn it and say, no, we would cause energy prices to go up. Well, that's not necessarily good either, because that's an unexpectedly large flood of revenue into the coffers of the Iraqi government, which means then corruption can take over. And corruption and misgovernance can lead sort of the fledgling Iraqi regime to completely mess things up and to crumble before they've had the time to develop any institutional memory or any longevity. So really, I think if you read a whole lot of articles about Iraq and how they're pinning a lot of hopes on their petroleum revenues, if you watch carefully, you'll see the link evidence that goes both ways. And you can be prepared to say, in the status quo, the amount of revenue they can count on is pretty stable. And if that's shaken up, if there's volatility is a very good word to describe this, then that is what puts Iraq in danger. And then you've got Middle East instability, and that can escalate and quite possibly outweigh the affirmative's case harm. Okay. One other thing that I saw that I was really happy to see, this is a little bit dorky, so forgive me, but there's a book out by Michael T. Clare. It was published near the end of last year, and it's entitled The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. Get this book. Not only does he have sections of it that are about marine resources and about the ocean, but back in my day, we were always glad to see Michael Clare write another book because he always wrote good debate evidence, and apparently he's talking about resource scarcity and about how that is going to be a driver of international conflict between some of the regional and even great powers. So if you haven't cut that yet, you want to. It might wind up in your affirmative case. It might wind up as some of your disadvantages on many different parts of the topic, but that's a book I would try to get my hands on. Okay, a couple of other arguments. I think you're going to find that a lot of the global type problems, that one of the first things authors suggest is that the United States use trade pressure and trade leverage. So at the risk of sounding like I'm stating the obvious, you want to go out and you want to load up on the arguments that U.S. trade sanctions do not work. They do not result in compliance. They tend to backfire. There's I'm not entirely sure what you'll find, but my suspicion is if you go out and you check United States efforts over the years to use trade pressure to get Japan to stop its whaling, right now Japan is being sued by Australia because Japan is trying to use the science exception to the current international regime governing whaling, and they're really kind of junking up their scientific claims because all they really want to do is take a lot of whales because whale meat is worth a lot of money in the Japanese market. But that's just one example. What you want to do some searches for trade sanctions and ocean, trade sanctions and environmental, and look for authors who are saying these backfire, these don't result in compliance, these result in complaints of the World Trade Organization, they result in retaliation, they result in trade agreements, negotiated free trade agreements being eroded. Find every argument you can that those are really a bad idea, and I think that that's a set of arguments that is going to get a lot of use over the course of the year. That'll wind up being time well spent that you invested over the summer. The last one that I think is kind of interesting is do searches for ocean and piecemeal, ocean policy and piecemeal, ocean policy and integrated planning, because a theme that comes up again and again is that when you're trying to manage marine resources and when you are trying to do an effective job of stewarding those resources, you can't do it threat by threat. That the planning has to be integrated, that all the different organizations and watchdogs have to coordinate their efforts. And they throw out the word piecemeal like it's a dirty word, but it's a beautiful word for negatives because it means affirmatives who come in with a small affirmative aimed at one particular problem, aimed at just shark finning or just flame retardant runoff. That's a piecemeal solution. And that monkey wrench is the attempt to have an integrated approach to protecting the ocean. So, if I were you, I would go and do some searches and see what's the best you can find, talking in favor of an integrated approach and talking about how piecemeal approaches to individual threats are actually sort of sabotage and tend to backfire. And then, of course, when you're putting your affirmative together, you want to be on the lookout for your explanation of how your plan is actually the gap in the integrated approach that's currently coming together, and how your plan is the missing puzzle piece that will make everything else more efficient and more effective, because you're going to have to be ready to answer that argument. So, those are some negative arguments for your toolbox, some broad spectrum positions. None of them is going to cover the entire topic, but I think that they have such general applicability to areas of the topic that will wind up being popular that it's worth your while to spend some time going out, getting the articles yourself, reading the articles yourself, not waiting for them to show up in source books, and knowing the author's claim from the first sentence to the last period at the end of the article, because that helps you when it comes time for you to explain those positions.